Welcome to the devotional series, Pondering the Parables, the podcast edition, episode 11, subtitled Always Be Prepared. And I'm Pastor D-Walk. Well, we'll take a little bit of a time out from our Psalm a Day, Keep Satan Away devotionals and return once again to the parables. We turn our attention today on another one of the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven is like parables. This one traditionally entitled the parable of the 10 virgins, or the 10 maidens. But before we get into our devotion and reflection today, I do want to give a shout out to one of my rabbis, one of my mentors, Dr. Philip Reynolds, who will be giving his final sermon as a senior pastor after 40 years of service in the ministry. And I just wanted to publicly congratulate him on a life well lived and all of the help that he gave to me as an aspiring pastor, and all of the guidance and instruction that he gave to my clan, to my kids as they were growing up in church. Thank you very much. Godspeed and God bless, Dr. Reynolds. And I know that while you're hanging up the cleats as a senior pastor, God has more in store for you. So good luck and Godspeed as you go forward. So back to the parable of the 10 virgins. We find this story in Matthew's 5th discourse, known as the Olivet Discourse. And that's because Matthew locates this discourse. And remember, discourses from Matthew are like these long sermon series. And he locates this one, the last one, during Jesus' last week on earth. And specifically as Jesus and his disciples were traversing across the Mount of Olives from Bethany, where they were staying, and on into Jerusalem, where they would worship at Temple Mount. And also Jesus would continue to publicly teach, as was the custom of all rabbis at the time. And as a reminder, Matthew structures his gospel around these 5 discourses, or sermon series, as I mentioned, plugging the narrative details and all of the historical events before and after each of these discourses. Now, if you have a red letter Bible, as I've said before, it's very easy to see where these discourses are in Matthew's gospel, because they're these long sections of just read. If you don't have that red letter Bible, then they're also easy to spot, because at the end of each of the discourses, Matthew writes, after Jesus said these things, and then off he goes into his narrative. Now, the subject of this Olivet, this final discourse, is the kingdom at the quote-unquote end times. And we've noted that an aspect of the kingdom of God is that it is not just a future place or state of being, as these parables are explained by Jesus. They also have a realized here and now component to them, where we can actually help Jesus and God usher in the kingdom through our right belief and our right actions. But the message of this particular parable is very much future oriented. It describes the coming of the Lord Yeshua as he brings forth the kingdom and into the eternal state of being that we will at one time enjoy. But as we have seen in many of the other kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God is like parables, there's also a prophetic exhortation and warning, not just for future hearers, but for the hearers and the readers of the text in the here and now. And further, there is judgment and there are ramifications if the hearers and the readers don't heed Yeshua's advice and warning. And we've seen this over and over as Matthew describes these parables by Jesus. So let's read from the text the parable of the 10 virgins, or the 10 maidens. It comes from Matthew chapter 25, and it's verses 1 through 13. And again, this is Jesus speaking. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. Now the bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom! Come out, let's meet him!" Then the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Sir, sir," they said, Open the door for us. But he replied, I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore, Jesus says, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. The parable of the bridegroom, of the 10 virgins. So as we reflect on this parable, we need to pay a little bit of attention to its location in this quote-unquote end times discourse. A quick reading of the previous chapter, chapter 24, which is the beginning of this Olivet sermon, opens up a reality that Jesus was trying to communicate to his hearers. There's going to be a period of time, we'll call it a gap, from the quote-unquote present time, which is the time that Jesus was on the face of the earth, and the quote-unquote end of time when he will return again. So the obvious question for us is this: when exactly will the end times occur? It's a question of questions that every generation of Jesus followers have asked, including the followers who are listening to him in person. And at the end of chapter 24, this question is evident because Jesus addresses it in verse 36. He says, in answer to the actually implied question, no one knows about the day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son of Man, but only the Father. And so the next obvious question to ask is this: well, if we don't know the day or the hour of his coming, what should we do in the meantime? And Jesus answers that question for us. Keep watch. He says in verse 42 of chapter 24, be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. What then follows is an analogy involving a master who was away and servants tasked with keeping the master's property and business going in his absence, and the expectation of what the master will find when he suddenly reappears. And then Jesus launches into our parable for this day, the parable of the 10 virgins. The story feeds off the traditions of weddings in the first century in the Jewish culture. We spoke briefly of some of these traditions during our reflections regarding the parable of the wedding banquet. And in the tradition, after a wedding was announced, the couple was arranged in an arranged marriage, by the way. A betrothal period would commence and take place while the bridegroom and his family prepared the household for the new bride. And this period could last months. And when all was prepared, a parade of sorts was common, as the bridegroom would suddenly send word to the bride and her entourage that he was on the way to escort his lady to the marriage ceremony. Thus, it was incumbent upon the bride and her entourage to be ready for the big day. As the plot of the parable plays out, it's clear that some of the bride's entourage were not prepared. They had not purchased oil for lamps, and they begged their colleagues to help them out. But they were turned down and had to desperately search for oil. The bridegroom arrives, and as the saying goes, the show must go on. The doors were shut to the banquet, and these lazy or these unprepared virgins were denied entry because of their lack of preparation. So I think the faith lesson today is pretty obvious. Many believers spend a lot of time in our day and age trying to figure out when Jesus' return will be. Many years ago, I fell into that trap and spent a lot of time and energy studying the scriptures to determine when his second coming would occur. But I've come to realize that that's a fruitless endeavor. My time is better spent preparing for his coming via obedience to his word and doing the next right, just thing in order to help prepare the way for his advent. And so, my friends, the exhortation today is straightforward. Always be prepared. If he were to come today, would you be ready? Godspeed and shalom. Pastor D. Walk signing off.